A locked cabinet inside the U.S. Treasury holds a secret so massive, so carefully buried, that if the full truth ever surfaced, it could shake the foundations of power itself. For years, officials insisted there was nothing to investigate. Yet buried in those files are thousands of unexplored transactions, international money trails, and financial fingerprints tied to one of the darkest criminal networks in modern history. And the strangest part isn't the scale of what was found. It's the speed and determination with which powerful people moved to shut the door before anyone could look inside. The first hint that something was deeply wrong came when investigators discovered nearly $1.1 billion moving in and out of a single account associated with a man the world knew as a predator of women and young girls.
Flowing in and out of just one of Mr. Epstein's bank accounts. If you ask me, that is more than 4,000 potential lines of investigation right there. Hundreds of millions more flowed through other accounts. That's even a lot more to investigate. The file shows that Mr. Epstein used multiple Russian banks, which are now under sanctions, to process payments related to sex trafficking. A lot of the women and girls he targeted came from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and elsewhere. One shudders to think about the kinds of people who must have been involved in trafficking these women and young girls out of those companies and into the Epstein web of abuse. Again, these are all potential leads, Mr. President, the Department of Justice ought to be digging into. This is about years and years of international sex trafficking. None of this is a hoax. None of it is a scam. And I'd like to say I consider it insulting to the intelligence of the American people for the Trump administration to simply say there is nothing to investigate here. Now, when the Trump administration came in with a lot of fanfare about transparency and openness, I said, I'm going to follow up on that. So I wrote to the Attorney General, Ms. Bondi, Treasury Secretary Bessent, FBI Director Patel, and I asked them all to produce the Epstein file to the Senate Finance Committee so it could be reviewed. In fact, I've made that request multiple times. The Trump commitment to transparency based on the response didn't mean a whole lot because they just refused. Here's what one Treasury official wrote back to me. I'll quote here. The Department of Treasury has previously made documents available relating to the matter in response to your inquiries. Accordingly, we understand that you have the information you seek from the Treasury related to this request. We thank you for your attention to this important issue. Mr. President, for anybody who's familiar with how these discussions go in Washington, D.C., what I just read was code for the bureaucracy saying, you're asking for information, go pound sand. The Trump administration may be trying to close the books on the Epstein sex trafficking. But I want it understood as a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, where we spend a lot of time looking at where substantial sums of money are going, particularly if they may be promoting wrongdoing and helping to evade taxes. We are going to stay on this fight to hold the wealthy individuals accountable for the harm that they clearly were involved in injuring the young women and others in this sex trafficking. So I'm going to have more follow-up for Attorney General Bondi very quickly. As for today, Mr. President, if she doesn't want to do the investigating, doesn't want the DOJ to do it, let me just restate my original demand. have that Treasury information given to the Senate Finance Committee and have us, on a bipartisan basis, do our work. That's what we do in important investigations. If the Trump people believe they need additional authority to carry out the requests that I make again this afternoon, let me offer to help them write the bill myself. The idea that there is nothing more to investigate, not when you have 4,000 wire transfers, many of them associated with the possibility of wrongdoing and sex traffic promoting. The idea that you have that and there's nothing to investigate when it comes to the Epstein sex trafficking operation is ridiculous. Pam Bondi was the Attorney General in the state of Florida, where a lot of the Epstein crimes were committed. The Attorney General ought to know better, of all people. Mr. President, I can't begin to understand the President's handling of this or why he thinks this is just going to go away. But I'm here to say that our investigators have spent 3 full years looking into this. And the reason why is because we feel so strongly about the horror of sex trafficking and our commitment to root it out. The President of the Senate is new to this body, but I'm sure he's dealt with these issues before. You can't have a much bigger horror in front of you than sex trafficking abuse. So we're talking about real evil done to women and girls by Jeffrey Epstein. And Mr. President, nobody gets to sweep that under the rug. I yield the floor.
Not a celebrity, not a billionaire philanthropist. No, the figure at the center of this case was an individual whose network operated in the shadows, whose crimes spanned continents, and whose silence protected names nobody has ever been allowed to see. Yet somehow, the official story became, there's nothing left to investigate. Nothing. After thousands of wire transfers? After international banking connections? After years of trafficking accusations that spanned half the globe? Something clearly didn't add up, and the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the responses became. It started with a routine congressional inquiry. Investigators wanted to follow the money, because in cases like these, money doesn't lie. Money leaves breadcrumbs. Money exposes the people who helped, funded, transported, protected, or turned a blind eye. But right after the requests were sent, the doors slammed shut. Agencies that had once promised transparency suddenly acted like the information was too sensitive to share. Officials who once claimed they would expose everything suddenly insisted nothing existed. Even stranger, some of the very people responsible for investigating these crimes were quietly blocking the release of the records. Why? What was buried in those pages? Before anyone could answer, a bombshell dropped. The Treasury Department revealed that investigators had been allowed to see only a portion of the file. What they saw was enough to raise alarms across multiple agencies. Buried inside were the details of 4,725 wire transfers, each one potentially tied to a moving part of a global trafficking pipeline. That's not a typo. For 1,725 transfers linked to just one account, not counting the other accounts that held hundreds of millions more. Think about how many names that could represent. How many companies? How many banks? How many countries? How many people with the power and resources to make the truth disappear? Investigators found that the money wasn't just moving inside the United States. Payments flowed through foreign financial institutions, including multiple banks in Russia that were later placed under sanctions. These weren't random business transactions. Treasury files showed that some payments were directly connected to operations involving women and girls trafficked from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and other regions. That alone should have triggered full-scale, multi-agency investigations. Instead, it triggered silence. When those findings were brought forward, investigators expected cooperation. They expected the Department of Justice to act. They expected the financial trails to be followed. But almost overnight, the tone changed. The same DOJ officials who had previously expressed support for deeper investigation suddenly claimed there was nothing suspicious, nothing requiring further review. Requests for documents were ignored. Letters were brushed aside. The official story became, the matter was over. Investigators tried again. They wrote to the Attorney General. They wrote to Treasury. They wrote to the FBI. They explained what they had seen, just a fraction of the information, but enough to know the full file likely contained explosive material. Instead of answers, they received a message so dismissive, so bureaucratically cold, it practically translated to "don't ask again." Treasury officials responded with a line that became infamous within the investigative team. "We understand that you have the information you seek." Except they didn't. They had maybe 10% of the file, maybe less. Behind the scenes, analysts tried to make sense of the transfers they did have access to. Large sums of money appeared to move through shell companies, offshore accounts, and intermediaries whose identities were masked. Some transfers were tiny, just a few $1,000s. Others were massive. Some were timed in clusters that suggested a coordinated network. Some were routed through countries known for lax financial oversight, making it almost impossible to identify the real sender or recipient. But what connected these transactions wasn't their size. It was the pattern, the timing, the repetition, the way certain individuals appeared again and again, just enough to raise suspicion but not enough to form a complete picture. That missing picture is exactly what investigators were trying to access, and exactly what top officials were blocking. Part of the frustration came from the realization that one of the key officials involved in stonewalling had direct ties to the region where many of these crimes occurred. As Attorney General of the state where numerous victims were first identified, she was expected to be the strongest advocate for full transparency. Instead, she became one of the strongest barriers. Victims who waited years for justice watched as the very person who should have pushed the hardest to uncover the truth instead placed the files behind a wall of red tape and silence. And still, investigators persisted. For 3 years, they studied every scrap of financial data they had. They followed partial leads. They interviewed witnesses. They traced suspicious transfers. They analyzed gaps in the records, trying to imagine what was inside the portions they were never allowed to see. The deeper they went, the more obvious it became that the full file could identify individuals whose involvement had never been made public, people who may have financed or facilitated trafficking, people who appeared in social circles but never in courtrooms, people whose names might fill headlines if the Treasury cabinet door were ever opened. That if those files were released, what would they show? Lists of enablers? Hidden financiers? High-profile individuals with too much to lose? Companies that processed payments without asking questions? Or something even more disturbing, something officials believed was too explosive for public view? It's important to remember that none of what investigators described was speculation. The billions in transfers were real. The foreign banks were real. The victims were real. And the pattern of obstruction was very real. But the identities hidden within those pages remained sealed, locked away in a cabinet that only a handful of people have ever accessed. The silence surrounding the file raises one unavoidable question. What could be so damaging, so politically explosive, that officials preferred accusations of secrecy over transparency? Because when a government chooses secrecy in a case involving trafficking, money laundering, and international abuse networks, it rarely means there's nothing to see. It usually means there's too much to see. Too many names, too many connections, too many powerful people who would rather this chapter remain closed forever. To this day, oversight committees are still fighting to access the full records. Every unanswered request, every delayed response, every closed door only deepens the suspicion that the truth is far darker than anyone has publicly acknowledged. And the victims, women and girls whose lives were shattered, remain at the center of this silence, waiting for a justice system that has repeatedly promised transparency but delivered excuses instead. This story isn't about political speeches or media drama. It's about a system that allowed a predator to operate for years, protected by wealth, influence, and the people who benefited from his network. It's about a paper trail that could reveal the full scope of that network and the extraordinary efforts taken to keep it hidden. It's about thousands of wire transfers that could unlock answers, but instead remain locked inside a room the public isn't allowed to enter. And that brings us back to the cabinet inside the Treasury building. A simple metal drawer containing files powerful enough to change everything we think we know about this case. Files that could identify names, transactions, and connections that have never been exposed. Files that officials claim contain nothing, even as they fight to keep them sealed. Files that hold answers the public deserves, answers survivors deserve, because truth doesn't hide itself. People hide it. And history has shown that when secrecy and power work together, the victims are always the ones who pay the price. If you believe these files should be released, if you believe transparency matters, if you believe the truth shouldn't stay locked in a cabinet forever, then stay with this channel. Because we're going to keep digging until every unanswered question gets the attention it deserves. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more deep dive investigations, and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps bring the truth closer to the surface.